Okay, welcome to family systems theory, which is my second favorite theory after attachment. And another one of the theories that I just carry around with me all the time and use to make sense of my personal relationships, past and present, my workplace situations, all kinds of dynamics. Just a note that the Smith and Hammond textbook chapter on family systems theory mentions Bronfenbrenner, and in this class we're not going into Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory since it's covered in other HDFS classes. Let's see, so like I mentioned, I wear a systems hat all the time, and so it pops up for me in so many different examples, probably on a weekly basis. So here's just a couple of recent examples. So, we were having conversations in my family recently about giver and taker roles, right? And how that's kind of, as we're going to talk about in this lecture, related to overfunction, underfunction, but how you don't want to be stuck too much in a real giver role in a system or a taker role in a system. And it's easy though, once you're in that role to have a hard time getting out of it, right? And so we're talking about, in our family, one of us in the family is kind of stuck more in a taker role. And we were talking about how that person kind of needs to get out of that role, because they're not in that role in other systems in their lives with their friends, with romantic partners, but they're kind of stuck in that role in our family a little bit. Another just funny, quick example is, at dinner I brought up to my kids, who are teenagers now, that I thought maybe because I was so funny, I was taking up all the funny in the family system, and they were feeling like they had to be more persnickety or grumpy or irritable. And of course, they laughed and told me I wasn't that funny. But that's still kind of how I was thinking. Like, if somebody's joking around all the time, it's hard for other people to have that kind of fun role. So let's start by understanding how family systems theory came about. Many of these theories that we're going to learn about have kind of intellectual traditions or roots in a lot of different disciplines before they made it into our field in family studies. And systems is one of those. And I'm just going to highlight two other fields that systems came from. One is the field of cybernetics, or the study of machines, and one is the general systems theory, which came out of biology. Norbert Wiener was a mathematician, and during World War II, he was asked to figure out how to get anti-aircraft guns to hit German planes moving so fast that it was impossible for the pilots or co-pilots to recalibrate the settings every time they missed. And so he designed a machine that could basically regulate itself to realize it had missed its target and could recalibrate and go after the target again. And so this, the important idea that came of this was that you could create a system with its own feedback loop that could tell itself whether it was on course or off course. So a home heating system is a good example of a machine feedback loop, or a machine cybernetic system. So your thermostat, you set it for the temperature that you want, say 70 degrees, and it is taking the temperature of your living room to determine whether or not it is 70 degrees or not. And if the temperature of the living room is lower than that, then it's going to tell your furnace to kick on until it heats it to 70, and then once it reaches that, it's going to tell the furnace to kick off. So this is a self-regulating machine system that is a cybernetic system. So it illustrates feedback loops, and it also illustrates this idea of circular causality, that A causes B, causes A, C causes A, causes B, causes C, and it keeps going around and around. Gregory Bateson was also a mathematician like Wiener and an anthropologist, back in the day when people could be kind of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary more easily. He would later become one of the first family therapists, because you didn't need training back then to be a family therapist. And he was actually married for some time to the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead. Well, anyway, he met Norbert Wiener at a series of interdisciplinary meetings called the Macy Conferences in the 1940s. And his conversations with Wiener about feedback loops influenced how he thought about families. And he eventually applied that cybernetics idea, or the feedback loop metaphor, to families. And so we're going to see that coming up on some slides. kind of when we talk about feedback loops and circular causality. So another intellectual tradition of systems theory that was developing away from cybernetics was general systems theory by Ludwig von Bertalanffy, an Austrian biologist. And he was basically theorizing about how living systems kind of regulate themselves. And so a lot of concepts that we're about to talk about came from Bertalanffy. So first he developed his theory related to biological systems, and then he himself went on to write about it as it could apply to families. And so a couple of key ideas here was this idea that a system is more than the sum of its parts. And so Bertalanffy talked about how, machine systems like a watch is more than just a collection of cogs and springs, or a cake is more than just a pile of flour, eggs, and sugar. Something else happens when all of these elements are combined. There's an interaction, right? And so in order to understand a system, we have to look at not only all of its parts, but all of its interactions. So we're going to hear more about that. And then another key idea is that systems can be more open or more closed to the environment. And so the living systems have to be open to their environment in some way, right, to take in oxygen or carbon dioxide or water or things like that. Machine systems might seem more kind of closed. And so this metaphor also got translated to families, or this idea that families could be more open or closed to environmental influence. And we'll talk about that more as well. For each theory that we study, I'll go over the theoretical assumptions and concepts. And I won't ask you to know the difference between an assumption and a concept because they kind of blur together and overlap. But technically, an assumption is something that is a foundation of the theory that underlies the theory, kind of like we learned about in the What is Theory lecture. And a concept is a kind of term or idea that makes up one of the nouns of the theory. So we've talked about wholeness already with that Bertalanffy idea of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I use a clip from an improv show as an example of wholeness here, that how we make sense of what's happening in improv is it's more than just the actors, and the audience and Drew, it's how they all kind of interact and come together, right? It's not just the parts, it's all the interactions. So that's that idea of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And then a second concept or assumption of family systems is this idea that all parts of a system influence other parts of the system. We can definitely see that in the improv example too. And a mobile is often given as an example of interdependence, since you can see that picture there where if one part in the mobile gets added on or taken away or moves, it affects all parts of the mobile that have to readjust. So we could imagine, for example, if in a two-parent family, if a mom gets a new job and she loves it and is working more hours than usual and is now earning more money than her partner, that's not just going to affect her, it's going to affect everybody else's labor, the kids, her partner, maybe how her partner feels about his or her job and their earning power, right? So there could be a lot of things happening there. And then interactions and circular causality, I'm going to talk more about on the next couple of slides. And this builds on this idea of interdependence, that we interact in ways that kind of have these cycles that kind of keep going. So an example here might be the good cop, bad cop parenting model. So I'm really strict with the kids because you seem too soft and you spoil them. And then you think I'm too strict with them, so you try to be more fun. And then I think somebody's got to hold the rules. And so I keep holding the rules. And so we've got this kind of feedback loop that's going around and around. So we'll hear more about those on these next slides. As we come to understand systems theory, we learn that problems occur in complex cycles in which the problem behavior could have been maybe introduced by one person, but it really gets reinforced and maintained by everyone. So here's our first example of a simple problem cycle occurring between a father and his 9-year-old daughter, Jen. And so Dad thinks that this is Jen's problem because she lacks initiative around chores And Jen, of course, if she could voice it, might say that her dad's always on her, and he's the one who's the problem because he's got too high expectations and he's too critical. And so neither one is really realizing that the problem doesn't lie in Dad or Jen, but it lies within their interaction. And so when we map a cycle like this, which is one thing that family therapists often do, is map it out with a family so that they can see it, it gives them insight into the systemic nature of their problem and begins to maybe help them think about ways to break their problem cycle. So for example here, instead of Dad just telling Jen to trim the hedges or something like that, Dad could say, "Hey Jen, I was thinking you're getting older, it's time to reevaluate your chores. What are you interested in doing? Here's some possible ideas. What works for you? Why don't you think about it and get back to me?" Or why don't we, that kind of thing. So letting her take more initiative right away. Or when she's not doing it right, he could not micromanage her, but then afterwards kind of explain what he thinks is important in accomplishing the chore. So very related to those ideas of interaction, circular causality, is just the concept of feedback loop. And I wouldn't ask you to know the difference between circular causality and feedback loop. I'd probably kind of use those interchangeably. And so then kind of tied into that feedback loop circular causality idea is the concept of homeostasis. And this one also came from Bertalanffy, the biologist, and that basically he said that systems regulate themselves in a way to keep themselves in balance. And so we could imagine that biological systems were doing this. Your body's regulating itself all the time. You know, for example, I read a research study recently about mice that says your bones decide how much you need to weigh, and they are constantly kind of regulating your metabolism to help you gain more weight or lose more weight, you know, kind of regardless in some ways of how many calories you're taking in, because your body wants to maintain its kind of weight homeostasis. So we're going to see some more homeostasis examples coming up that'll make this more clear, but it's basically that a system, family system, you know, living system wants to have some sort of balance or stability or equilibrium. But Bertalanffy also recognized that systems seek change too. We don't always stay the same, so it's a little bit of both. So as we are interdependent and as we interact with each other in these circular or cyclical ways, again, we're often doing that to maintain balance in a system. And so what can happen is that family members can end up taking positions that seem more polarized or opposing than they genuinely are. So these first two patterns, criticize, withdraw, or overfunction, underfunction, we saw those in the previous slide about Dad and Jen. And in parent-child relationships, parents are most likely to be in the critical or overfunctioning positions, and children are in the withdrawing or underfunctioning positions. And so you may be in the overfunctioning role in one relationship, such as home, where you do chores, but you might find yourself in an underfunctioning role in another system. You know, perhaps at your child's school, you let others volunteer, or at work, you let other people step up. And for example, if you found yourself in a system where everyone would prefer to underfunction, you might be more likely to step up and do more because you're worried that no one else will do the task. So your behavior could be influenced by the system. I found this happening to me a couple of years ago. For my son's soccer team, they needed parents to arrange boxed lunches, and it wouldn't normally be this thing that I was volunteering for, but over time no one was volunteering, right? And so I became a little bit more of the overfunctioner in that system, even though I would have preferred to underfunction and not have to do so much. And then that strict permissive, that's that good cop, bad cop idea, where if one person's being more rigid, then the other person will get to be more lax, and they can tend to kind of polarize and get more stuck in these seemingly opposing positions. Here's another example of a cycle in which Maria and Isaac have become more polarized in how they are dealing with Maria's cancer diagnosis. Although it might be that Maria tends to be more emotional and Isaac more rational, it may also be that they're reacting to one another and they seem more different than they actually are. So Isaac is likely more emotional than he appears, and Maria may have more capacity to be rational and unemotional than she is displaying. So from a systems perspective, this becomes a perpetual cycle. Maria is so upset and falling apart about the diagnosis that Isaac feels like he needs to be the strong one, and then Maria feels like no one is expressing the sadness or the pain of all this, and so she manifests it. Isaac doesn't express sadness about Maria getting cancer because he doesn't want to upset her more or make it worse, but then she is alone in feeling sad, and this makes her feel sadder. And so the cycle has a way of perpetuating itself, even though neither person wants it to. So in the previous slide with Maria and Isaac, we see that when a family undergoes stress, sometimes some members of the family take the role of expressing more emotion in a family while others take a more stoic stance. Although this, of course, could be in part due to gender socialization or personality, there's also a systemic pattern occurring. So for example, let's say something really stressful happens and I'm upset and I'm emotionally breaking down. If you are the family member who's with me as that's happening, you might find it hard for you to fall apart too, because then the system will be unbalanced and we'll worry that we might just drown in this painful emotion. So you might decide to be strong for me and minimize your emotions and instead focus on being more rational and problem solving. Or another example in terms of the pessimism optimism, if I'm being really pessimistic, you might be more optimistic and try to help me focus on the bright side. And although sometimes this is helpful, it can also leave me feeling like I'm weak, emotional, pessimistic, and that there's something wrong with me, and it can kind of deepen my experience in this position. And in fact, you might even like it if I'm kind of emotional, weak, and pessimistic, because then you get to feel strong, rational, and optimistic. And my falling apart can maybe help you not have to face difficult emotions because I'm doing that enough for all of us. So you can see how we could get more polarized and kind of react to each other in unexpected ways. I'm hopeful that you'll take this understanding of circular causality out into your personal and professional life and look for these patterns. And you'll start to think about kind of your role in maintaining these problem cycles, and maybe you'll think about how to change your behavior rather than the behavior of the other person, which you usually don't have control over. And I tried playing a hiking game with my kids to help illustrate circular causality or systemic patterns. There are 4 of us in my family, my husband, me, my son, my daughter. And so my kids hate to hike, but we make them do it sometimes. And so when we were on a hike, I said, okay, we're going to play a game, and one of us is going to be the complainer, one of us is going to be the validator, one of us is going to be the bright sider, and one of us is going to be the problem solver. And so we would take turns switching up those roles. So somebody would be the complainer and say, it's so hot, I hate this. And the validator might say, it's hard to hike when it's hot. And then the problem solver, the quick fixer, might say, there's a shady tree up ahead, and we'll stop and have a snack. And the person on the bright side who's focusing on the bright side might say, it could be worse, it could be hotter, or it could be raining, or, we're almost there. And so I was kind of illustrating that idea that we can take these different positions that then kind of influence each other and create these patterns. Boundaries is another concept from general systems theory from Bertalanffy, and it basically describes the border between a system and its environment, and how much information can flow back and forth across that border. And as we're going to see when we get to the circumplex model, you want kind of a semi-permeable boundary or border, right? You don't want it to be totally open and diffuse, and you don't want it to be totally closed. And so this gives us kind of the right amount of cohesion for a family, where they have a sense of connectedness, but they can still take input from teachers or doctors or therapists. But they don't feel just like totally disconnected from each other either. And then rules and roles. Basically all families have rules as to how different elements of the system meaning the individuals, kind of behave. So basically rules often around what we can do or rules around our roles. So for example, we might have a explicit rule like take off your shoes before we come into the house, or we can have implicit rules like no one sits in dad's chair when it's TV time, or as my kids have learned, although my husband is generally super friendly and responsive, he doesn't like to be talked to when he's having what he calls his cereal moment, right? So the kids have learned the implicit rule, like don't try to talk to dad when he's having his cereal moment. We're hoping that families have flexibility in their rules and roles, especially as kids get older or situations change. And we're going to talk about that with the Circumplex model coming up. In family systems theory, subsystems are part of a system that can be analyzed separately as to how its interactions within the system influence, other parts of the system. So, for example, we might look at how conflict in a couple or sibling subsystem will affect the rest of the family. And also, ideally, there are some boundaries between, for example, the parenting subsystem and the children or sibling subsystems. We'd like to see a strong parental subsystem. And so we might notice that, for example, if there's a weak parental subsystem or conflict between the parents, then sometimes a child can act out because there's not always a clear kind of boundary around the parental subsystem, or because there's conflict in the parental subsystem. Articulating boundary issues in families is challenging, and so this slide is just to give us a better sense of what that might mean. So boundary issues have also been referred to as boundary dissolution, interparental boundary problems. I'm referring to it as parent-child boundary disturbances. The literature has not been quite consistent on the term. It can be with two parents, right? Especially with that interparental boundary where they're having conflict and then that's causing issues in the rest of the family. Parents who are together or separated or divorced, but boundary issues can also occur in single parent families too. And clues that there might be boundary issues going on are when we see enmeshment, which is basically closeness that is so extreme that it's at the detriment of individuals' development, specifically like kids or adolescents' development, that they can't kind of do their developmental tasks associated with independence or autonomy. Intrusiveness, right, where a parent is not kind of respecting a child's kind of autonomy or privacy, and kind of violating those more kind of personal boundaries in small or big ways, right? Parentification, we're going to talk more about what that is, but basically when a child gets bumped up to the parent subsystem. Triangulation and alliance formation are pretty related, right? When a parent maybe forms and tries to rope a child in and form an alliance with them to kind of deal with conflict, maybe even have the child act as mediator between two adults and their conflict. And then a kind of a takeoff on triangulation is scapegoating, is when we manage the conflict in a family system by making kind of someone out to be the scapegoat. So we're going to get more into some of the research specifically on parentification and triangulation. Some examples of boundaries and subsystems are both parentification and triangulation. So starting with parentification, if there's not enough hierarchical boundaries between parents and kids, then we often see a child drawn into the parental subsystem. Parentification is pretty common in family systems, and so you may have been parentified as a kid, sometimes for good reasons. It can happen when a parent is overwhelmed or ill or stressed or disengaged or using a substance. And being parentified can have both positive and negative effects. It has small negative effects on adolescent and young adult well-being, so increased depression, anxiety, excessive caretaking, reduced identity exploration, but it's also correlated with later empathy, social responsibility, flexibility, independence. And so it's thought that outcomes are more positive if the parentification is more moderate or more time limited, or maybe even more normative for the culture or the situation. As we might imagine, parentification can get more common in divorced families or single parent families where we might have a parent who needs more help or kind of needs someone at that parental level and pulls a child kind of up to that level. And then triangulation, we've got some more examples coming. Those have more negative effects, you can see, but that's more about kind of complaining or venting to another individual or deciding to team up against another person. And so you can see there that those for emerging adults can have more negative effects over the long term, that you might not feel as confident in your ability to form healthy relationships and worry about that more. So here's a classic example of triangulation in a family where we might have two parents, a dad and a mom, who are in conflict. And as a way of kind of coping with that or relieving that stress or tension, kind of a natural inclination is for dad to complain to his son. So again, conflict is often managed by triangulating a third person in. You can relate to this if you've got fighting with some other person, you want to confide or kind of vent to somebody else rather than kind of address the conflict directly with the person that you're fighting with. I had a work colleague who used to say something like when she would complain about somebody else, she would say, "Let's hate her," right? Like together, we'll come together and hate her. Those concepts of black sheep and scapegoat are just variations of triangulation. Basically, a family deals with tension or conflict by identifying one person as the black sheep or the scapegoat and kind of puts them in that role, focuses on them as the problem and the one that needs to be fixed. And oftentimes that person ends up acting like the black sheep or the scapegoat. So I see this happen maybe in classrooms of kids where they focus on one kid being the problem to kind of reduce the teacher's irritation in general. Let's look at the Circumplex model, which is based on family systems. The Circumplex model is an outgrowth of family systems theory and kind of goes further with those constructs of open or closed systems, boundaries, and how that is related to cohesion, and also that those ideas of rules, roles, and that we need some flexibility or adaptability. And the Circumplex model is useful for assessing families and also guiding how we intervene with families to help them become more functional. And there have been a lot of articles written with the Circumplex model as its base and using the scale that goes with it that's called FACES, which is now, I think, in its fourth or fifth revision. And so if you find a theory article that talks about Circumplex or is using the FACES scale, that tells you that you're still a part of systems theory. Later they added communication in, but for the purposes of this lecture, we're just going to focus on the two dimensions that the Circumplex model addresses around cohesion and flexibility and adaptability. So cohesion is about how a family system might balance separateness versus togetherness and how they kind of manage emotional bonding, boundaries, time together, space, decision making. And so you can see that there's a whole range there, but you're trying to be somewhere in the middle and not on the extremes, which is considered less healthy and research says has less positive outcomes for family members. So a disengaged family often has more emotional separateness. There's little involvement among family members, a great deal of kind of independence. Individuals are like ships passing in the night, right? Their own thing in their own time and space, their own interests, and they don't really turn to each other for support or problem solving. On the other extreme is an enmeshed family where there's too much emotional closeness and too much loyalty. Individuals are very overly dependent upon each other and too reactive to one another. Not enough maybe personal separateness, not enough kind of private space. And all of the energy tends to be focused mainly within the family and outside influence is not allowed. And so the classic example here is My Big Fat Greek Wedding, right? Where there's almost too much kind of loyalty. You can't make your own decisions. You can't have your own time and space. And we're not going to take input from the outside. So flexibility is about leadership, control, discipline, roles, rules. And again, we want to be mid-range here. Um, on the one hand, if there is no kind of flexibility and the system is really rigid, then that's often kind of like that, dictatorship where one person is in charge and very controlling, and the rules are very rigid, and the roles are very rigid, and they don't change. On the other end, we could have a chaotic system which has kind of erratic or limited leadership. Decisions are more impulsive, roles are unclear, and that can be unhealthy in a different way. This gives you an example of what kinds of questions are asked on the FACES scale, which would be a Likert scale, ranging from like 1, strongly disagree, to 7, strongly agree. Some examples of how cohesion is defined or flexibility is defined. And again, if you see a research study using the FACES scale, that tells you that they're using the Circumplex model. This chart just combines cohesion and flexibility and tells you that a family could be mid-range on both, which puts them kind of in the green, one of the green boxes, even though families can vary in how much flexibility and cohesion they have and still be healthy. Or they could be mid-range on one dimension, but extreme on the other dimension, which puts them in a gray box. Or they could be extreme on both dimensions, which puts them in a red box. And so what the research says is that being in a red box, generally has, for example, the worst outcomes for kids' behavior. So let's talk about how some systems ideas just could generally help professionals working with families, whether that's as educators, as counselors, therapists, prevention and intervention specialists. I have a few slides here just translating family systems theory to interventions that you can use in your professional life. And so what family systems theory would tell us is that in our work with families, we want to look for patterns of interaction. So how does each person's behavior fit within the overall family pattern, that idea of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and we think about what's the function of each family member's behavior in the system, those ideas around interdependence and homeostasis, and how we can kind of create polarizing feedback loops that end up influencing each other. So a theme with systems is that you are watching how they interact and listening to that, not just what they are saying. So you're thinking kind of who's speaking for the family, who's agreeing or disagreeing, who's staying silent, where does there seem to be conflict or coalitions. Are there any kind of triangles? Is anyone kind of being scapegoated? Sometimes families will show up in family therapy basically saying, so-and-so is the problem. They often will bring in, for example, a kid who's the problem, when really there's a lot of conflict in the couple system or in another part of the system, and the kid is just kind of manifesting some problematic behaviors and is identified as the problem. We can also use what we've learned from the Circumplex model, not only thinking about kind of connection and emotional bonding, but we can also think about kind of, is the level of a cohesion kind of mid-range, or does it seem to be more problematic? How about flexibility? And thinking, what's the influence of extended family members as well. So whenever we're working with families, we also want to have a systemic view of the problem. A family often identifies a problem as existing within one person, but as the professional, we are going to maintain our alliance with everyone. We're not going to align with some against others. And we're going to view problems as not so much existing in one person a lot of the time, but as existing in the interactions between family members. And we're going to focus a little less on the content of what they're saying and a little bit more on the process by which they're interacting.